Well, Ciaran and Dorota, it's a pleasure to have this opportunity to have a conversation and to celebrate your winning the strategy and general management category in this year's awards with your case, Ryanair flying too close to the sun. I thought I'd start by asking, what is the case about?
So the case looks at the business model evolution of Ryanair since its inception in the mid-1980s through to 2017. And so the case was really motivated by a gap in the marketplace when it came to business model innovation and evolution. Dorota and I had been looking for cases for years that dealt with this topic and that provided a local example that our students could relate to. And Ryanair is a company that everybody relates to, anybody who has experienced Ryanair or read about Ryanair. And so what the case does is it starts in the early days. It talks first about the search for a business model, how the then chairman of Ryanair, David Bonderman, sent Michael O'Leary over to Dallas to meet Herb Kelleher, the late founder of Southwest Airlines, and how O'Leary was transfixed by the model. He stood on the runway looking at how quickly they turned the planes around, and he came back to Dublin knowing that that was the model that Ryanair was going to pursue. And so the early stages of the case talks about that early search for the business model. It looks at the economics and the evolution of the airline and aviation industry in Europe, how it's a very dog-eat-dog industry, very, very unfavorable economics. Yet despite this, Ryanair, because of its efficient business model, because of the policy choices that it has made, has just, performed admirably. And prior to up until the pandemic, continued to do so. And so that was the background. We then look at the changes that Ryanair needed to make, starting around, I think, Dorota, 2013. And 2013 was a pivot point for Ryanair because it discovered that about 70 million customers were choosing to pay a small amount more to fly with other airlines because they offered a more humane service. And they didn't treat them like cattle on an airplane. And so that was the instigation of what was known as the Always Getting Better program. And the Always Getting Better program, there were two major imperatives. One was to fix the pain points so as to get those customers coming back, where they would come back to Ryanair and they would have a higher service level. The second major thrust was to introduce a series of digital initiatives that would represent a major growth strategy. What Ryanair did around 2015 was it realized that because it had such a large installed base, it had at the time probably about 40 million registered users on its platform, on its website. It recognized that it could sell those customers not only airline tickets, but a bunch of other services. So it had long been involved in car hire. And so it really ramped up its car hire. It also introduced an initiative which has had mixed success called Ryanair Rooms, where customers could book their hotel accommodation. It has even gone into selling, if you go to London, theatre tickets and a range of other services. The other part of that is selling seats on other airlines. So it did a bunch of partnerships where it would feed flights in from different parts of the world, and Ryanair would then channel those flights into Europe. And that served as a major growth initiative. And all of these digital initiatives are housed in what's known as Ryanair Labs, a kind of a research and development laboratory or a startup within an airline where they're focused on the website, but they're also focused on these digital initiatives. And this latter strategy, which is profiled in detail in the case, is known as becoming the Amazon of travel, where it leverages that large installed base in order to serve all customers' travel needs. And that's where the strategy kind of was at prior to the major crisis that it encountered in 2017. And everything had been going swimmingly. It had been growing its revenues, its profits had been growing, its load factor was very, very high. Everything was going really, really well. And it suffered what would have seemed like a minor technical glitch in that it had a rostering crisis. And usually Ryanair has to schedule its pilots from, I think, April 1st to March 31st, their leave over that particular year. But in 2017, they had to shift to a calendar year. And so they had to basically schedule 7 months of leave in about 4 months. And that meant that they didn't have enough reserve crew in order to manage handover, and its punctuality suffered. And so it made the decision to cancel a bunch of flights. Ryanair, or Michael O'Leary, appeared, on various press conferences explaining to customers why they had canceled so many flights. And that was a critical point in the airline's evolution, because now the unions and the staff had the upper hand. And they used that in order to mobilize during the autumn of 2017. They started forming different groups, not only in Dublin, but across the European Union. And that led to the decision in December 2017, where Ryanair recognized unions for the first time in its history. And so what the case illustrates is how a great strategy that was doing swimmingly can be undermined by the neglect of human capital. And that was the one thing that Ryanair had not paid attention to. It was the one chink in its armory. And as soon as it got into difficulty with the rostering crisis, that provided the opportunity for the staff in order to mobilize and build up an offensive move. And the rest is history. Ryanair became unionized, added about 100 million to its cost base. It spent most of 2018, negotiating with different unions in different countries. It all had to be done separately. And it was a very tumultuous time.
And perhaps what I might add is just a little bit about Michael O'Leary himself, because I think the persona of the CEO has been quite interesting to include in that case study, even if only for illustrative purposes and to strengthen some of the points that we're trying to showcase, and also to make the case fun to read. And that's some of the feedback we were getting from our students, that it's just a joyous case to read. Michael O'Leary has been very consistent in how he led the airline to implement that business model. It's a ruthlessly implemented business model, except for those cracks around human capital, which Ciaran has just mentioned. But he was actually at a point in time even more involved than just as the CEO. He would have been the person behind some of the publicity stunts with the idea of, let's talk about Ryanair, whether it's a good thing that we talk about them in a positive light or in a negative light, that doesn't really matter. It matters that there's actually a lot of talk about Ryanair being out there in the media, increasing the visibility, basically free publicity for the company. So oftentimes it would have been even controversial what Michael already might have said, but it was creating that publicity for the airline and consistent with the low-cost business model, cheap publicity.